Now I'm going to be discussing lesson 20, updating and deleting your models. So in this lesson, just covered constructing a model, edit form, updating user records in your database, and deleting user records. But I'm going to specifically touch on updating user records and how that works. So let's jump into the code. So firstly, I have my models over here, of course. My model for user, to create a new user. And in this case that I'm going to discuss, to actually edit and update the user's profile or document right in the front end. And then in my main.js, right, I have all these get and post routes, but I'll specifically touch on the update one, right? So the get request for editing, to get the edit page, and then the put request to update our user's account. So firstly, this router.get is a get request for the edit page. So a get request is made when we access this specific URL link, right? And as soon as that get request is made, the edit function in user's controller is basically called. So if I go to user's controller, let's see, here's the edit function over here that is basically executed. It has a callback function with request, response, and next as parameters, right? So we know that the request that is made is when we access that link. And then here in this callback function, we basically have rec params ID, which is basically the parameter for a specific. So it's the ID parameter for the user, right? As a user ID. So basically here, that's basically firstly stored in user ID variable, right? So now it has the user's specific ID that references that specific account for the user. Then we use user model, and we use the find by ID method, right, to basically find the user by using the specific ID of that user. Then this function here, this promise is executed with a callback function that has a parameter user, which stores the user ID of that specific user that we're finding, right? And when that's done, what happens is, using response, we will render the edit page. So basically the edit page is, the edit page is basically referring to this EJS over here. So this EJS essentially is the page where you can edit your user's account, basically by updating the first name, last name, password, email address, and zip code, then clicking the update button. So basically, if I can access that essentially over here, so basically when I make that get request to here, right, able to access that edit page essentially. So what this does is it accesses a specific user's account. So we need to put the ID, right, of that account. So if I'm gonna access this account over here, this is referring to the params basically, and it stores the user. So this is basically the request params that I basically discussed right now. Over here, so the request params ID is stored in user ID. So that user ID is basically stored in here. So when I place it there, I can access the specific account for the user that I want. So we access Paul Pogba's account, right? As you can see, Paul Pogba in the database with this object ID, which is referring to the request param ID. So that's how I access the page in order to update the user's account. Then basically, if this is not executed, then this cache block just logs an error. But since that is done and we're on that page, now you can basically update the page, right? So to update the page, when you update the page, basically, or let me say when you update the user's account, what happens is a put request is made. So that put request route is basically declared here. So we have this put request where this specific URL link is accessed, and when that is, well, basically the put request is made to this URL link right here, users ID, which is the request param update, right? And when that happens, this update function is called in users controller, as well as this redirect function that is called in users controller. So the update function is immediately called when that put request is made, so it can update the user's account, which is this function here. So essentially what this function has is, or this method has, is basically this callback function, which has request, response, and next as parameters. And in the callback function, we are storing the params.id for the request in the user ID. So specifically referring to this. Then that's stored in user ID. So that's the user's ID for the account. And then user params, right, basically now has this assigned to it, which is basically the name and email. So name specifically referring to first and last name will be updated. So you update the body of the first name and the body of the last name. For email, we're updating the body of the email, the body of the password as well as the zip code. Then of course here it's using the once that's done, basically we're using user model to find by ID and update, right? So this function is what we're using to basically find the updated version of the user's account. So once that's basically done, right, this promise is executed with this callback function. Now user is gonna store that user's ID, an updated account. And as a what happens is we're gonna be basically redirected to this URL here. So user ID. So to that specific user's account via the user ID of that account, right? So as soon as we update it, so let's change the surname. We basically redirected to the specific user's page or that account that shows the details. That's because we passed the user ID over here and stored that in res locals redirect. And yeah, we're storing user, which is basically containing all this information, or it contains what we found, and we're storing that in res.locals user. So once that's done, it shows this in the front end, the updated version of the user's account. Then of course here, then there's just a cache block that logs the error if this is not executed. So that's how the put request is done in that function as soon as we fill in the form to update a user's account. Alright, so yeah, that's basically a summary of lesson 20. Cool.